District Courtroom 12, Pennsylvania 11:14 a.m. The gavel slammed like a gunshot. The jury finds the defendant, Kyle Brennan, guilty of second-degree murder. A low gasp rippled through the courtroom. Kyle's mother clutched her chest, whispering a strangled "no" as her son, 22 years old, white, wide-eyed, stood motionless, his skin pale as snow. He scanned the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. "I didn't kill anyone," Kyle murmured, barely audible. A bailiff stepped forward with handcuffs. Suddenly, from the back of the room, a raspy voice cut through the silence. "Wait, that boy's innocent." All heads turned. A scruffy man with wild hair and a torn army jacket pushed his way forward. The courtroom buzzed in disbelief. Kyle stared at the stranger. He had never seen him before. "I saw everything. That night, corner of 5th and Ashland." The room fell still. The judge raised an eyebrow. Kyle's defense attorney stood up, stunned. "Your Honor, I request an immediate halt to sentencing. This man must be heard." The entire trial teetered on the edge of reversal. Kyle Brennan had always been a kid who kept his head down and his grades up. In the blue-collar town of Meadville, Pennsylvania, he wasn't known for causing trouble or making waves. He was the type of student who fixed his teacher's printers, who stayed late after physics class to ask about diode circuits, who spent more time with his laptop than with friends. At 22, he was a senior at Allegheny Tech, a commuter school with a solid engineering program and not much else. Kyle had earned a scholarship there, full tuition, thanks to a high school science fair project where he'd built a solar-powered phone charger out of recycled parts. For most kids in his neighborhood, that would have been a fluke. For Kyle, it was just the beginning. His father had walked out when Kyle was 12. His mother, Deborah, worked as a CNA at St. James Memorial Hospital, always on her feet and always behind on bills. Kyle never complained. He knew how hard she worked, and he saw his education as the one ticket out, for both of them. To help cover rent, Kyle took a part-time job at a hole-in-the-wall cell phone repair shop just outside the downtown district. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid $12 an hour, under the table, and his boss let him close up at night. He had a simple routine: school, work, study, sleep, repeat, until the night everything changed. It was Thursday, June 3rd, humid, the sky low with rolling gray clouds. Kyle had just finished his shift and locked the shop by 11:45 p.m. His usual ride had fallen through. His friend Malik's car wouldn't start, so Kyle decided to walk home. It was a straight shot. 15 blocks, 30 minutes. But at midnight, nothing ever feels that simple. He cut through an alleyway behind a row of abandoned shops, a shortcut he'd taken dozens of times before. The pavement was slick from a passing drizzle. A flickering street lamp buzzed overhead. The only sound was his own footsteps. Until he saw something. Someone, slumped beside a dumpster. Kyle slowed down, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. It was a man, middle-aged, wearing a dark windbreaker, one leg bent under him awkwardly. His head tilted toward the wall like he'd fallen mid-step. Kyle thought maybe he was drunk, maybe passed out. He stepped closer. That was when he saw the blood. It had pooled beneath the man's head, soaking into the concrete and glistening in the streetlight. Kyle's breath caught. His stomach flipped. For a full 5 seconds, he didn't move, just stared. Then his instincts kicked in. He pulled out his phone with trembling fingers and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? There's a man here, I think he's been attacked. There's blood. He's not moving. I'm at, behind Ashland and 5th. Near the alley. Please send someone. The operator asked if he could check for a pulse. Kyle stepped closer, crouched low, and touched the man's wrist. Cold. Do you know him? The voice asked. No, Kyle whispered. I found him like this. Within 7 minutes, police arrived, lights flashing, radios crackling. Kyle stood back with his hands raised, pale and shaking. Officers began roping off the alley. A paramedic confirmed the man was dead. Multiple blunt force injuries to the head. Then a detective, tall, bald, mid-40s, approached Kyle. You the one who called it in? Kyle nodded. The detective glanced down at Kyle's sneakers, white canvas, now speckled with red. You get blood on your shoes? I didn't notice. I think I stepped too close when I checked him. You touch the body? Just to see if he had a pulse. The detective didn't respond. He looked back at one of the officers and gestured subtly. Moments later, Kyle was escorted to a squad car for questioning. They said it was routine. That night turned into morning. And that morning became the worst day of Kyle's life. Down at the precinct, he was asked the same questions over and over. What were you doing there? Why didn't you take the bus? Did you know the victim? What happened to your friend who usually picks you up? Kyle answered everything honestly. He was nervous, yes, but he wasn't hiding anything. At 6:30 a.m., they told him he could go home. By 9 a.m., he was being called back. New evidence had come in. A blurry security camera image from a liquor store at the end of the alley showed Kyle walking toward the scene at exactly 12:17 a.m. The coroner later estimated the time of death to be 12:15. To the detectives, it was enough to shift him from witness to suspect. By the time his mother arrived, pale, hair tied in a rush, voice trembling, they were reading Kyle his Miranda rights. He was being arrested for murder. The town buzzed. It wasn't every day that a murder happened in Meadville. And it definitely wasn't every day that a clean-cut white kid with good grades got cuffed and marched into the county jail. Some people were shocked. Others whispered rumors. He must have snapped. Maybe owed the guy money. Maybe it was drugs. But Kyle's friends knew better. Malik tried to speak up. So did a few classmates. But no one wanted to hear from kids who weren't there. And Kyle? He couldn't even process it. He sat in a freezing cell, staring at the wall, asking himself over and over again, why me? 2 blocks from where Kyle Brennan's life was unraveling under fluorescent police station lights. Another man sat silently, staring into the night. Earl Mays didn't have a bed. He didn't have a home. But he had a bench, half-rotten wood, bolted into concrete at the edge of Liberty Park. It faced the alley near 5th and Ashland, which meant on most nights, Earl had a front row seat to all the city's sins. And Earl had seen it all. Thieves and drunks, lost teenagers and cheating spouses, drug deals under flickering street lamps, screams muffled by closed windows. He never said a word, not to cops, not to bystanders, not to the few bleeding souls who stumbled near him asking for directions. The world had long taught Earl that the truth from a man like him didn't weigh more than trash tossed in a bin. But on June 3rd, at exactly 12:12 a.m., Earl saw something he couldn't unsee. He had been dozing on his bench, a thin blanket draped over his legs, when he heard the first shout. You owe me, Paul. I'm not asking again. The voice was low, urgent, and came from the alley just across the street. Earl turned, shifting the blanket. He saw 2 men. One wore a hooded gray sweatshirt, the other a black jacket. They were close, too close for a calm conversation. Then came a second voice, gruff and defiant. Back off. You'll get it next week. You show up like this again, and I'll make sure you. Then, it happened fast. The man in gray lunged. Earl saw a flash of metal, short, curved like a hook knife or a utility blade. He saw it jab toward the other man's chest, then up toward the side of his head. The black-jacketed man fell hard, struck the dumpster, then collapsed to the ground. The man in the hoodie stood over the body for just a second. Then he bent down, possibly to grab something, and sprinted toward the end of the alley. As he passed beneath the street lamp, Earl caught a glimpse of a tattoo on his left wrist, a spider. Black and thin, with long curled legs. Earl's heart pounded. His hands trembled beneath the blanket. He knew what he'd just witnessed. Murder. He sat frozen. Within 5 minutes, another figure entered the alley from the opposite end. A younger man, slim, with a messenger bag over one shoulder. Earl watched him kneel beside the body, fumble with his phone, make a call. The boy looked terrified, innocent. Then the flashing lights arrived. Earl pulled the blanket higher over his chest and leaned into the shadows. The next day, Earl walked past a TV store with 5 flat screens flashing the same local news headline. Student arrested in late-night homicide, Kyle Brennan, 22. Taken into custody. Earl stopped. The image was blurry, but it was the same boy from the night before, the one who had called 911. The one who arrived after the attack. The reporter called Kyle the primary suspect. She said there were no other witnesses. That police believed robbery might have been the motive. A clean-cut white kid, maybe desperate for cash, maybe cracking under pressure. It was all speculation, But Earl could feel the judgment in her tone. He looked at his reflection in the glass. A thin old man with matted hair and eyes too tired to argue with the world anymore. He had been invisible for years. He liked it that way. But now? Now an innocent kid might pay for a crime he didn't commit, because no one knew Earl had seen the truth. That afternoon, Earl walked aimlessly. He thought about going to the police. But the memory of his last encounter stopped him cold. It had been 12 years ago. Earl had witnessed a hit and run outside a diner near the old rail yards. A dark blue SUV mowed down a teenage cyclist and fled the scene. Earl had written down the license plate and took it to a nearby precinct. He was laughed out the door. "You expect us to believe a guy sleeping on benches has a memory better than security cameras?" one officer mocked. Another suggested Earl made up the story for reward money. No follow-up, no report filed. 2 weeks later, Earl saw the same SUV parked behind a city employee lot. He said nothing. That was when he decided. His voice didn't count. But Kyle's face haunted him. The look in that boy's eyes when he crouched beside the victim, confused, panicked, trying to help. It wasn't the look of a killer. Earl had seen killers. They moved fast, disappeared faster. They didn't call 911. Still, fear kept Earl silent. He spent the next week circling the courthouse from a distance. Sat across the street, holding a paper cup filled with coins that he never asked for. He watched lawyers and reporters walk past him like he wasn't there. He overheard conversations about slam dunk evidence, student debt motive, and clean narrative for the media. Each day, Kyle looked a little smaller as he entered the courthouse in cuffs. Each day, Earl clenched his jaw a little tighter. On the morning of the sentencing, Earl sat on his bench watching the rain sprinkle onto the sidewalk. The headlines were already written. The jurors had gone home. And still, Earl said nothing, until he looked up at the clouds and whispered to himself, "If I stay quiet, it's like I killed that boy myself." He rose, knees cracking, and walked toward the courthouse. He didn't know what he'd say. He didn't know if they'd let him in. But he was done being invisible. The courtroom felt like a tomb. Everything about it was cold, the pale marble walls, the polished oak benches, the stiff-backed security guards lining the perimeter. But no chill matched the frost that clung to Kyle Brennan's spine as the word, "guilty," echoed through the chamber like a bell tolling the end of a life. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Across the aisle, his mother collapsed into a quiet sob, her fingers digging into the arms of her seat like she was trying to hold onto something, anything. Kyle's lawyer, Missy Vargas, sat stunned. The evidence was weak, the timeline full of holes. Yet the jury had chosen the simplest story: a kid with debt, a dark alley, and a dead man. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, lifted her gavel. "Sentencing will proceed immediately." A bailiff moved toward Kyle, pulling out the handcuffs. Kyle didn't fight. His hands lowered mechanically, wrists turning inward. And then, wait, it was sharp, unpolished, cracked like a radio breaking through static. All eyes turned. At the very back of the courtroom, a man stood, tall, gaunt, unshaven, wrapped in a weather-stained army jacket. A hush swept the chamber, as if everyone was unsure they had heard him correctly. "That boy's innocent," he shouted again. Stepping forward, the bailiff instinctively moved to intercept. "Sir, you cannot." Missy Vargas was already on her feet. "Your Honor, I request a pause in sentencing. That man may be a witness." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Brennan, do you know this man?" Kyle shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am, I've never seen him before." The judge studied the stranger. "Sir, identify yourself." The man straightened. "My name is Earl Mays. I'm a veteran, and I was near the alley the night Paul Hickey was killed." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor stood, half laughing. "Your Honor, we've had no prior disclosure of this witness. No cross-examination. I object to any further delay." But Missy's voice rose, firm and clear. "If this man truly saw what happened, then this court is on the verge of condemning an innocent person to prison based on an incomplete picture. I move for immediate in-chambers testimony." Under oath, with both counsels present, the judge looked at Earl for a long time. "Very well," she said, finally. "Mr. Mays, follow the bailiff." Kyle watched, stunned. as the man who had appeared from nowhere was led to the witness room behind the courtroom. It felt like watching a thread unravel in slow motion, one that might lead back to the truth. Or into another kind of darkness. 30 minutes later, the hearing resumed. The judge looked visibly changed, more alert, more solemn. She leaned forward. This court has just received an unscheduled but sworn testimony from Mr. Earl Mays. What he provided cast serious doubt on the conviction rendered. As such, I am placing a stay on sentencing and ordering a review of new evidence. Bailiff, release the defendant. The handcuffs were lowered. Kyle blinked. For a second, he didn't move, as if afraid the freedom might evaporate if he breathed too hard. The room burst into noise, reporters scribbling notes. The prosecutor storming out. Kyle's mother gasping with relief. Earl stood quietly near the side of the courtroom, his expression unreadable. Missy walked over to him and extended her hand. "Thank you," she said. Earl didn't shake it. He simply nodded once. "I just told the truth." Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed like lightning. Kyle was ushered through the front doors flanked by his lawyer and 2 deputies. Reporters shoved microphones at him, shouting questions. "Mr. Brennan, how do you feel? Did you know the man who spoke on your behalf? Do you believe the police framed you?" Kyle didn't speak. His mind was still trapped in the courtroom, still echoing with the words, "That boy's innocent." Missy stepped in, answering for him. "We have no further comment at this time. This case is not over." Earl exited from a side door, unnoticed. He didn't want credit. He didn't want a headline. He just wanted to disappear. But this time, someone followed him, back at the courthouse steps. Missy handed Kyle a copy of the official hearing transcript. "You should read this," she said. He described the killer. Tattoo on the left wrist. Spider-shaped. Same build as someone on the precinct's persons of interest list last year. Kyle blinked. He remembered that? From the shadows? Every detail. What if no one had listened? Missy exhaled. "That's the thing. We almost didn't." That night, Earl returned to his bench in Liberty Park. He sat down, pulled out a flask, and stared at the alley. He wondered if the killer still walked that alley. Wondered if his voice had done enough. Or if it would all be twisted again. Ignored. But then a car pulled up. It was a rusted Honda Civic. Kyle stepped out. He crossed the street and approached the bench. Earl looked up. "You again. I wanted to say thank you." Earl stared at the boy. This close, he could see the worry hadn't left Kyle's face. It probably wouldn't for a long time. "You don't owe me thanks," Earl said. "You didn't deserve what happened. No one does." Kyle sat beside him. "You could have walked away." "I almost did." They sat in silence, just 2 silhouettes beneath a flickering street lamp, one lost in what might have been, the other still trying to understand what almost was. The next morning, a storm brewed, not in the sky, but inside the Meadville Police Department. Missy Vargas paced the hallway outside the district attorney's office, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. She clutched a folder labeled, Supplemental Testimony, Mays, containing Earl's sworn statement, copies of his ID and veterans file, and a brief list of possible suspects that aligned with his description, chief among them. A name circled in red ink, Vincent Doyle. Inside the office, the assistant district attorney, Mark Trenner, was already combative. "You want us to tear apart a closed case," he snapped, based on the word of a man who's lived off a park bench for 10 years. Missy didn't blink. "That man is a veteran. He's been sober for over a year. And he gave us a physical description down to a tattoo on the left wrist. One that matches a person you already flagged in the Hickey investigation 6 months ago. You just never followed up." Trenner leaned back in his chair. "We lacked cause. And quite frankly, we had a tighter narrative with Brennan. You had a convenient narrative," Missy said sharply. "But now it's unraveling. Your case fell apart the second you heard Earl Mays speak under oath. And if you don't reopen the investigation, I will file for an immediate motion to dismiss the conviction and sue this department for malicious prosecution." Trenner exhaled through his nose. "We'll look at the footage again. But I'm not promising anything." Missy stepped closer. "I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to do your job." Meanwhile, Kyle sat on the couch at home for the first time in weeks. The television was off. His textbook sat unopened on the kitchen table. His phone buzzed constantly, but he didn't answer. Most messages were from classmates or reporters. A few were from people he hadn't spoken to in years. Only one person he really wanted to hear from hadn't called, his father. He picked up a photo from the bookshelf, an old one, cracked at the corners, of him and his dad at a science fair, holding up a homemade light sensor. That was before the divorce, before the Vanishing Act, before silence became their only communication. His mother entered the room carrying a glass of orange juice. Her eyes were puffy, her voice tender. "You need to eat something." "I'm fine, Kyle." She sat beside him, gently placing the glass on the table. "You're not fine. You almost lost everything. You still might. They haven't cleared you yet." "I know." His voice was hollow. "I just feel stuck. Like I'm in limbo." Deborah reached out and took his hand. "That man, Earl, he gave you a second chance. But second chances aren't always gifts. Sometimes they're responsibilities." Kyle looked up, eyes meeting hers. "Then what am I supposed to do with it?" She smiled faintly. "Fight back. Finish what he started." Back downtown, detectives scanned through archived footage near the time of Paul Hickey's murder. They expanded their window, searching 15, 20, 30 minutes before and after the attack. And then they saw it, at 11:58 p.m. 15 minutes before Kyle entered the alley. A man with a gray hoodie and a spider tattoo on his wrist entered a vape shop 2 blocks away. The timestamp placed him squarely in the area. Another camera caught him again, exiting at 12:05 a.m., walking briskly toward Ashland Street. That man was Vincent Doyle. Missy was notified immediately. She filed an emergency petition with the judge, requesting a temporary release of Kyle's house arrest and a court-ordered summons for Doyle to testify. But Vincent Doyle was nowhere to be found. Detective Sergeant Miguel Harper led the renewed search. He had doubts at first, most officers did, but the clarity of Earl's testimony, combined with the newly discovered footage, made things uncomfortably real. Doyle had a record: assault in 2014, armed robbery in 2016, drug trafficking in 2019. Hickey, the victim, was known to have lent money to men like Doyle at sky-high interest rates, often threatening bodily harm when payments fell behind. Harper looked into Doyle's last known address, a rundown apartment in East Meadville, but the landlord said he hadn't seen him in over a week. A girlfriend had once lived with him but had since moved to a trailer park in Crawford County. The trail was warm, but time was slipping. At night, Kyle sat beneath the same street lamp where Earl had once witnessed the murder. The air was heavy, damp. He felt like the whole city had changed color: gray skies, gray buildings, gray thoughts. Earl joined him on the bench without a word. He handed Kyle a folded piece of paper, a sketch he'd drawn of the alley, the position of the killer, the path he ran. Kyle unfolded it slowly. "You remembered all this?" Earl nodded. "When you sleep outside, you remember everything. For survival." They sat in silence for a while. Kyle finally spoke. "Why did you come forward?" Earl looked up at the night sky. "Because one time, I didn't." He paused. 12 years ago, I watched a man hit a kid with his car. Just drove off. I took down the plate. Went to the police. They laughed. Said I was just a bum trying to make money. That I imagined it. I gave up after that. Never said another word." Kyle swallowed hard. "And you think, if you had spoken up sooner, maybe that guy would have been caught?" "No," Earl said. "I know he would have. I saw him again 3 weeks later. Worked for the city. Parked behind the water department. That kid's family never got justice because I let them convince me I didn't matter." Kyle folded the drawing and slipped it into his pocket. "You matter now." The manhunt for Vincent Doyle didn't begin with sirens and flashing lights. It began with a name scribbled in red on a case file, an address that hadn't been updated in 6 months, and a silent urgency buzzing beneath the surface of the Meadville Police Department. Detective Sergeant Miguel Harper knew the type. Doyle wasn't a mastermind. He was a street player, aggressive, impulsive, the kind of man who operated in bursts of violence, then went underground when things got hot. The mistake most people made with men like Doyle was assuming they disappeared on their own. But Miguel knew. No one disappears alone. Someone always hides you. He started with the girlfriend. She was younger than Doyle by nearly 10 years. Her name was Lacey Crow, and she worked nights at a local bar near Interstate 79. Her trailer, tucked away in the edge of Crawford County, was one of those forgotten corners of rural America, rusting siding, a satellite dish held up with duct tape, and 3 dogs tied to a pole with bungee cords. Harper and his partner, Detective Rena Yates, approached just after sunset. They wore plain clothes, no lights, no sirens. Harper knocked twice. A woman answered, holding a cigarette in one hand and a baby monitor in the other. "Lacey Crow?" Harper asked. She narrowed her eyes. "Who's asking?" "Detectives. We're looking for Vincent Doyle." The cigarette twitched. "Vincent don't live here no more." Harper showed her the still frame from the vape shop camera, the one that captured Doyle's tattooed wrist. "We have reason to believe he was involved in a homicide 2 weeks ago. And we think he's come to you for help." Lacey stared at the photo. Her face hardened. "I haven't seen him." "Lacey," Yates said softly, "a kid is facing prison because your ex ran from something he did. If you know where he is, and you don't tell us, that makes you part of this." There was a long pause. Then Lacey exhaled slowly. "He came by last Thursday. Said he needed a place to lay low. I told him no, not with the baby. He left, but he said he might stay with a guy named Gunner. Over on Larchmont Street." "Gunner?" Harper repeated. "Big guy. Tattoos on his neck. Keeps pit bulls. Don't knock without a badge." Harper nodded. "Thank you." Lacey lit another cigarette. "Just, don't let him hurt anyone else." Larchmont Street was one of those parts of town no one included in the tourism brochures. It was row after row of peeling doors and busted fences, where people lived hard and left harder. The officers waited for backup before approaching Gunner's place. When the tactical unit knocked down the front door, they found no Vincent Doyle, just a basement mattress, half a bag of meth, and a drawer full of burner phones. But one of the phones had recent activity. A call placed to a gas station payphone near the Allegheny River. Timestamp: 2 hours earlier. Doyle was moving again. At the courthouse, Missy Vargas was working furiously. She filed an official motion to vacate Kyle Brennan's conviction, citing newly surfaced evidence and a potential alternative suspect. The motion included Earl Mays's testimony, the camera footage, and the current status of Doyle's evasion. The judge set a hearing date, pending new developments. Missy wasn't content to wait. She called Kyle into her office. "You need to prepare yourself," she said. "Even if they find Doyle, there's no guarantee he confesses. No guarantee the DA drops the charges against you." "I thought the judge paused everything?" She paused sentencing. "That's different from exoneration. Right now, you're still the accused. The difference is, you're a free accused." Kyle leaned forward. "So what do we do?" "We prove motive. We prove that Doyle had a reason to want Hickey dead. That's how we shift the weight." Kyle paused. "You mean like debts?" Missy nodded. Kyle stood. "Then let me help. You're not a detective, Kyle. I'm the one they tried to bury. Let me dig." That afternoon, Kyle visited the back room of the phone shop where he used to work. His boss, Jamal, still owed him 2 weeks' pay, but more importantly, Jamal had something Kyle needed: access to old phones. "Jamal, you said a few months ago that some guy came in asking you to unlock a burner, said he'd forgotten the password. You told me he had tattoos?" "Yeah," Jamal said. "Spider tattoo. Creeped me out." Kyle's pulse jumped. "Do you still have that phone?" Jamal scratched his beard. "Think so. Thought he'd come back. He never did. In the bottom drawer of a plastic crate." Jamal handed him the phone. It was cracked and greasy, but the home screen still lit up. Kyle brought it straight to Missy. They submitted the device as evidence to the police lab. Within 48 hours, the forensics team retrieved messages from the encrypted folder. Among them, texts between Doyle and Hickey, arguing about missing payments and threats of retaliation. One message read, "If I see you again without my money, I'll make sure you never threaten another man's daughter." And Hickey had replied, "Bring a blade if you're feeling brave. I got more muscle than you think." The messages were timestamped 2 days before the murder. It wasn't just motive anymore. It was premeditation. That night, Earl and Kyle sat once again at Liberty Park. The alley across the street dim and quiet. "They're going to find him," Kyle said. "They better," Earl replied. Do you think people like us, me, you, we ever stop being suspects to someone?" Earl looked at him. "No, but that don't mean we stop being truth-tellers." Kyle nodded, feeling the heaviness in his chest loosen. Just a little. The morning sky over Meadville cracked open with a growl of distant thunder. The weather, much like the town's mood, had grown volatile. Headlines flooded every local station and news site. Fugitive linked to alleged wrongful conviction still on the run. Phone evidence points to alternate suspect in Hickey murder. From bench to witness stand, homeless veteran reshapes trial. Inside the police station, the atmosphere was tense. Detective Harper stood over a digital city map. Red dots pinned across Doyle's last known locations: gas stations, motels, abandoned homes. Doyle's running scared. Harper muttered, "And scared men are dangerous." Detective Yates slid a printed report onto the table. Got a hit on a bus terminal security cam. 9:03 p.m. last night. Heading southbound. Where to? Pittsburgh, she replied, probably trying to disappear in the crowd. Harper didn't hesitate. Contact the Pittsburgh PD. If he gets lost in that city, we won't find him again. At the same time, Missy Vargas sat in her office downtown, reading through court transcripts. Her office bathed in soft gray light from the cloudy sky. Kyle sat across from her, silent. Missy glanced up. "You okay?" "I'm trying to be," he said. She closed the file. "I know this feels like it's dragging, but it's moving faster than most cases like this ever do. We've already filed for dismissal of charges. We just need confirmation of Doyle's arrest, or direct evidence tying him to the scene." Kyle leaned forward. "What happens if they catch him, and he denies it?" Missy hesitated. "Then we fight harder. But either way, his presence on the scene, the threats to Hickey, the burner phone, it's all building. It's not just your word anymore. It's real evidence. Corroborated. It's burning through the prosecution's case." Kyle's eyes dropped to the floor. "I still feel like I'm on trial." "You are, even when you're out of the courtroom." Meanwhile, the media firestorm had reached a new level. Reporters began digging deeper, not just into Doyle's criminal history, but into Kyle's trial itself. They uncovered inconsistencies, the rushed investigation, the unreviewed surveillance footage, and the decision to ignore a witness list submitted by the defense 3 weeks earlier. That list had included a homeless man near Liberty Park, but the court had dismissed it at the time as non-credible. That man was Earl Mays. Now, his name was everywhere. Earl wasn't comfortable with the attention. He kept to himself, avoiding cameras, ducking questions. But when a local nonprofit invited him to speak at a town hall about justice reform, he surprised everyone, especially himself, by saying yes. The night of the event, Kyle stood at the back of the library auditorium, watching as Earl stepped to the podium in a borrowed blazer. He looked out of place, but dignified. Earl cleared his throat. "I never thought I'd be standing up here. Not because I never wanted to speak, but because I didn't think anyone would listen." He paused. "When I first saw what happened that night, when I saw the real killer walk away, and that boy Kyle get dragged off, I froze. Because I thought no one would believe me. Because I'm poor, I'm dirty, I sleep in the shadows. That used to mean I was invisible." He leaned in. "But now I know, when you speak the truth, it burns through lies like wildfire. And it hurts. It forces people to look at what they ignored. And some will hate you for it. But others will follow your light." The room was silent. Then came the applause. Kyle blinked, trying to hide the sting in his eyes. The next morning, just after 6 a.m., Pittsburgh PD raided an abandoned textile warehouse on the south side of the city. They found Vincent Doyle asleep on a cot, a duffel bag filled with cash, drugs, and a .38 revolver beside him. He reached for the gun. He didn't get the chance. Within minutes, the arrest was made. News broke before noon. Missy's phone rang nonstop. Kyle's name began to shift in the headlines from accused to survivor. At the police station, under interrogation, Doyle refused to speak, but when shown the messages from his burner phone, when asked about his connection to Paul Hickey and the threats he made, he folded. "He came at me first," Doyle muttered. "I just finished it." "Then why run?" the officer asked. "Because I ain't stupid. You think they'd believe a guy like me over a dead man in a suit?" With Doyle in custody and his confession recorded, Missy marched into the courthouse with a new motion to vacate conviction based on exculpatory evidence and confession by alternate suspect. By the end of the week, a hearing was scheduled. The judge presiding over the original case sat on the bench, gavel in hand, as Missy stood beside Kyle. After review of new evidence, including a direct confession by Vincent Doyle and validation of the previously suppressed testimony from witness Earl Mays. She declared, "This court hereby vacates the conviction against Kyle Brennan. All charges are dropped." The gavel came down. And just like that, Kyle was free. Truly. Finally. Free. Outside the courthouse, he was met by a sea of reporters. This time, he didn't shy away. He looked directly into the cameras and said, "The system nearly buried me. But it also brought me back. Because of one man who refused to be silent." He turned to Earl, who stood nearby, hands tucked in his coat. "I'll never forget that." Earl just smiled. "Then make it mean something." Freedom didn't feel like celebration. It felt like silence. After the charges were dropped, Kyle Brennan expected something: relief. Maybe joy. A rush of closure. But as he stepped out of the courthouse that day, past the microphones and cameras, into the gray wash of the Meadville morning, he felt empty. The crowd applauded. Reporters shouted questions. His mother wept into a scarf. Earl gave him a nod from across the sidewalk. And yet, Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that part of him was still locked inside that cold courtroom, waiting for someone to say, "Wait, we made a mistake." He had been found, not guilty. But he hadn't been found innocent. Not in the eyes of everyone. Not even in the eyes of himself. Over the following week, Kyle tried to resume a normal life. He returned to Allegheny Tech, walking into classrooms where his classmates had whispered behind his back weeks earlier. Some offered awkward smiles. A few gave him high fives like he'd just won a football game. But most simply stared. His professors tried to be supportive, offering deadline extensions, praising his resilience. But even then, Kyle could feel the caution in their words. Like they still saw a question mark next to his name. He overheard one student say in the library, "He got off on a technicality, right?" Kyle didn't correct them. He simply packed up his books and left. Meanwhile, Earl Mays was experiencing something he never expected: attention. Real attention. The town that once stepped over him now invited him to speak. High school civics classes, college seminars, even a justice reform panel in Pittsburgh. He was offered temporary housing by a veterans support organization. A local business sponsored him with clean clothes. He got a haircut, a job offer, an ID card. For the first time in over a decade, Earl had a mailbox. But the spotlight came with pressure. People asked him to relive his trauma over and over. Asked him to comment on Kyle's future. On the justice system. On race and class and homelessness in America. And somewhere in the noise, Earl felt the weight pressing down again. He had told the truth. But now, that truth was being stretched to fit every narrative. To some, he was a hero. To others, a pawn. And to the system? Just another brief anomaly, useful for the moment, forgettable after. Missy Vargas watched both men struggle, Kyle in silence, Earl in overload, and she knew something wasn't right. The case was over. The charges were dropped. Doyle was in custody, awaiting his own trial. And yet, something still itched at the back of her mind. There had been too many shortcuts. Too many missing reports. The surveillance footage that had been overlooked wasn't just an accident. It had been marked as irrelevant in the internal notes by one of the junior detectives. The anonymous tip that had originally led police to suspect Kyle? Untraceable. No phone record. No witness statement. And then there was the original DA, Brian Cole, who had rushed the case to trial with almost theatrical confidence. Only to quietly resign 3 days after the charges were dropped. Missy started digging. What she found wasn't explosive. Not yet. But it was suspicious. Records showed that Vincent Doyle had once served as a confidential informant for the County Narcotics Task Force. His last recorded interaction had been 8 months before Paul Hickey's murder, around the same time Hickey began lending money to Doyle and his circle. A file marked inactive had been sealed by request of the DA's office. Missy requested access under a defense privilege motion. It was denied. That alone was enough to make her furious. Why protect a killer? Unless Doyle had still been useful to someone. Back at home, Kyle sat alone in his bedroom. A half-eaten sandwich rested on the desk. The news played in the background. They were showing his face again, this time next to Doyle's. Under the headline, "Justice Served? Brennan Free, but Doyle Stays Silent." Kyle turned off the TV. He opened his laptop and clicked into a blank document. For days he had wanted to write something. Anything. a statement, an essay, a post. But every time he tried, the words collapsed under the weight of what he'd lived. Until that night. My name is Kyle Brennan, he typed, and I was almost buried alive by a system that mistook silence for guilt. He kept going, not out of anger, not for revenge, but because if Earl had found his voice, so could he. The next morning, Kyle posted his story on a community blog. Within hours, it was shared across local forums. By nightfall, it was trending in the regional feed. He wrote about the interrogation, about the cold cell, about the feeling of being watched like a criminal when he had only tried to help. He ended the piece with a sentence that struck like a match. I didn't survive this alone, and neither should anyone else. Missy called him 2 hours later. You just started a fire, she said. The blog post was supposed to be a release, a quiet act of catharsis. A way for Kyle to reclaim a part of himself the court had stolen. Instead, it became a match dropped in dry grass. By noon the following day, the story had over 30,000 views. By evening, it was featured on local news stations and retweeted by several criminal justice advocates. People flooded the comment sections with outrage, empathy, and questions. Some shared stories of their own brushes with injustice. Others wanted names, judges, officers, prosecutors. Missy Vargas read every word of Kyle's post 3 times. Then printed it and placed it neatly on her desk next to a second. Older document. A file from the district attorney's office. Stamped sealed, authorized personnel only. The weight of it sat heavy in her gut. She took a breath, opened her laptop, and began writing a motion to unseal the file, again. This time, however, she included new arguments. Among them, public interest, media coverage, the inconsistency between the original prosecution and the newly discovered evidence, and potential suppression of exculpatory material. Attached was Kyle's essay. Then she added something else, something subtle but razor-sharp. A request for a judicial ethics inquiry into DA Brian Cole's handling of the case. 3 days later, Missy received a call from Judge Florence Eves, the same woman who had presided over Kyle's trial. I've reviewed your motion, the judge said, and while I'm not yet authorizing full unsealing of the Doyle file, I will allow an in-camera review. Just you, me, and the clerk. Missy paused. Thank you, Your Honor. I'm doing this off record for now. Judge Eves continued, but between you and me, something stinks. The in-camera session took place the following afternoon. In the small, windowless clerk's office behind the courtroom, Missy sat across from Judge Eves as the file was opened. It was thinner than expected. Only 12 pages. But what those pages revealed made Missy's pulse spike. The file documented a confidential informant agreement between Vincent Doyle and the County Narcotics Division. Signed 15 months prior, it authorized Doyle to provide information on street-level dealers in exchange for leniency in his pending assault case. The disturbing part? His informant status was still technically active at the time of Paul Hickey's murder. And tucked at the back of the folder, on a page marked Internal Notes, was a memo from DA Brian Cole. If Doyle gets into trouble, suppress exposure. Asset is too valuable for prosecution unless politically unavoidable. Missy's blood ran cold. Doyle had been shielded. Worse, he may have felt untouchable. She looked at Judge Eves, who sat still, mouth tight, eyes scanning the memo again and again. This changes everything, Missy said. Judge Eves closed the file. I'm authorizing a full unsealing. And you should prepare for what comes next. Missy didn't go home that night. She stayed in her office until 3 a.m., reviewing every case tied to Doyle in the past 2 years. One pattern became immediately clear. In each case, his charges were dismissed or quietly reduced, sometimes with no explanation. 3 of the victims were known associates of Paul Hickey. One was Hickey's own nephew. Suddenly, the murder wasn't just a drug deal gone wrong. It might have been a cover-up. Meanwhile, Kyle was beginning to feel the weight of attention again. He hadn't meant to spark a movement, but it was happening all around him. A student club at Allegheny Tech invited him to speak. He declined. Then a podcast requested an interview. He ignored it, but when a young black student named Jamar approached him after class and said, "Man, what you wrote, that saved me from quitting school." Kyle paused. Jamar continued, "I've had cops on my back since I was 14. Nobody ever says it like it really is. But you did." Kyle didn't know how to respond. He just nodded. That night, he texted Missy, "If you need help with anything, I'm ready." She replied 2 minutes later, "You just might." At the county jail, Vincent Doyle was starting to crack. 3 weeks into his incarceration, the heat from the media and the pressure from interrogators finally wore him down. He requested a deal in exchange for information, real information. He named names. 2 officers who had been feeding him intel. A narcotics sergeant who had rerouted a search warrant for Hickey's apartment days before the murder. And, most damning of all, DA Brian Cole himself, who had allegedly used Doyle's criminal record as leverage in multiple intimidation schemes. "He told me, if I ever went down, I'd never see trial," Doyle said. He said he'd bury the case before it reached court. Now, that web was starting to unravel. Missy met with Judge Eves again, this time not as a defense attorney, but as a whistleblower. "What you've uncovered," the judge said, "won't just impact Kyle's case. It could bring down half the DA's office." Missy didn't flinch, then let it fall. It began with a knock, not at the courtroom door, not at a press conference or police precinct, but on the side entrance of Missy Vargas's law office just after sundown. The woman standing there was tall, pale, early 30s, dressed in a black coat. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, and clutched a brown envelope tightly in both hands. Missy had just finished a long call with the Pittsburgh affiliate of NPR and was shutting off her desk lamp when she heard the knock. When she opened the door and saw the stranger, she blinked. "Miss Vargas?" "Yes. I work in the records department. County DA's office." The woman hesitated. Her voice wavered like glass before a crack. "My name's Alexis Banner, and I think I can help you." They sat in the back office. Missy locked the door, closed the blinds, and brewed a fresh pot of coffee. Alexis barely touched hers. She placed the envelope on the table between them like it was radioactive. "You need to understand," she said softly. "This could cost me my job. Maybe more than that. You're protected under Pennsylvania's whistleblower statute." Missy replied, "If what you have is credible, I'll make sure you're not alone." Alexis nodded, swallowed, and opened the envelope. Inside were 4 internal memos, all stamped, "Confidential, do not duplicate," each dated within a 4-week span before Kyle Brennan's arrest. The memos contained direct communications between then DA Brian Cole and 2 assistant prosecutors. The subject line on each: "Directive, expedite Brennan case." One message chilled Missy to the bone: "Dismiss alternative leads. Prioritize narrative consistency. If the boy folds, this is closed before press catches wind of Doyle." Another one read, "We cannot afford a public informant exposed in connection with a violent felony. Brennan is controllable. Doyle is not." Missy stared at the papers in silence. Then she looked up. "Why now?" Alexis looked away. "I was in that courtroom the day Kyle was sentenced. I archived the documents, the surveillance clips that were tagged irrelevant. I knew, but I told myself it wasn't my place. I needed the paycheck. I was scared." She paused. "But when he was exonerated, and when I saw Earl Mays speak on TV, I couldn't live with myself anymore." Missy reached across the desk. "You did the right thing." "No," Alexis whispered. "I'm trying to." That night, Missy scanned the documents, encrypted them on a thumb drive, and filed an emergency judicial request to present the materials before the State Review Board. With these memos, Doyle's confession, and Alexis Banner's sworn testimony, they could formally open a criminal investigation into DA Brian Cole's office. But she knew it wouldn't be enough. The public needed to see it. They needed to know the truth wasn't just buried, it was buried on purpose. The next day, Missy met with Kyle and Earl in a quiet diner off Main Street. Kyle had started smiling again, just slightly. Just sometimes. Earl looked more grounded than usual, dressed in clean clothes and reading from a local newspaper that now printed his name with something like respect. Missy slid the folder onto the table. Kyle flipped through the memos, each line slicing deeper than the last. "They called me controllable," he muttered. Earl leaned forward. "That's all we ever were to them. Pieces on a board, ones they thought wouldn't fight back." Missy looked at both men. "I'm going public. If you don't want your names involved, I'll respect that. But the fight's no longer about just clearing a name. It's about making sure this never happens again." Kyle didn't hesitate. "Use my name." Earl stared out the window for a moment. Then he nodded. Mine too. I've been invisible long enough. That afternoon, Missy released the documents to the press. Within hours, the story exploded statewide. Exclusive. Memos reveal intentional suppression in Brennan case. Whistleblower speaks out. They knew Brennan was innocent. Dawes office under criminal investigation for evidence tampering. Governor Lisa Farrington issued a public statement calling for immediate and transparent investigation. DA Brian Cole, now 2 months into retirement, refused interviews. His lawyer issued a bland denial. Mr. Cole acted with full integrity throughout his tenure and denies all wrongdoing. But public opinion was against him. And behind the scenes, more staff began to come forward, low-level clerks, former interns, even a retired assistant DA who quietly submitted a signed affidavit describing a culture of political targeting and internal gag orders. The wall had cracked. Now it was collapsing. Meanwhile, Kyle received an invitation to speak at a university panel on criminal justice reform. He considered declining again, but this time, something pulled at him. He accepted. The panel was hosted at a community college an hour outside Meadville. The theme: voice and system. Stories that force change. He sat alongside a man wrongfully convicted in 2003 and exonerated after 19 years. A woman who had served as a court translator and exposed corruption in juvenile trials. And Earl, who sat in the audience, nodding quietly. When it was Kyle's turn, he stood, adjusted the mic, and said, "I'm not an expert. I'm not a lawyer or a politician. I'm just a guy who got blamed for something he didn't do, and had no power to stop it." He paused. "But I found my voice. Not because I knew how to use it, but because someone else used theirs first. And now I understand, it's not just about being believed. It's about being heard." The room stood to applaud. And Earl, from the back, wiped a tear from his cheek. The state hearing chamber didn't look anything like the courtroom where Kyle Brennan had nearly lost his future. It was newer, brighter, no jury box, no criminal defendant's table, just rows of wooden chairs, high glass windows, and a panel of 6 state officials seated behind a long desk. They weren't here to convict or acquit. They were here to listen. Which, in some ways, made it more terrifying. Kyle sat in the second row, waiting to be called, his heart thudding like a slow drumbeat in his chest. Earl Mays sat beside him, calm as stone, hands folded neatly in his lap. "You okay?" Earl asked, without looking at him. "I don't know," Kyle replied honestly. "This time I'm not the one on trial, but it feels the same." Earl smiled faintly. "Difference is, this time they need your truth." Across the room, former District Attorney Brian Cole sat behind his attorney. Lips tight, face expressionless. The man who had once orchestrated Kyle's downfall now looked smaller. Not sorry, just cornered. Missy Vargas gave Kyle a reassuring nod as she walked past to take her seat as counsel. Then a name was called. "Mr. Kyle Brennan, please step forward." He rose and walked to the podium. The microphone was already on. He cleared his throat. "Thank you for giving me the chance to speak." He began. "My name is Kyle Brennan. I'm 23 years old. I was a senior engineering student when I was arrested for a murder I didn't commit." He paused. "I was just walking home from work. I found a man who'd been attacked. I called 911. I tried to help, but because of how I looked, where I was, and what time it happened, the police decided I was the most convenient story." He took a breath. "My family was shattered. My name was dragged through the mud. My future was frozen in place. For months, I didn't know if I'd ever be free again. And the worst part is, I thought I was alone." His voice grew firmer. "But I wasn't. A man named Earl Mays saw what really happened. A man who had every reason not to speak. Because the system had failed him before. But he stepped forward anyway." Kyle turned slightly, glancing at Earl. "His truth saved my life." He looked back at the panel. "But what I've learned is this. What happened to me wasn't an accident. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a decision, by people in power who wanted to protect their own. They suppressed evidence. They ignored leads. They turned a blind eye to the truth because they thought no one would challenge them." He leaned in. "Well, I'm challenging them now." The room was silent. "I don't want pity. I don't want revenge. I want a system that can admit when it's wrong, and a system that doesn't make it so easy to bury people like me." Kyle stepped away from the mic. The panel members nodded slowly. One of them even looked away, blinking rapidly. As he returned to his seat, Earl reached out and squeezed his shoulder. "You did good, kid." That evening, the news splashed Kyle's testimony across the state. Wrongly accused student speaks out in Cole hearing. Brennan calls out system. This wasn't an accident. It was a decision. Public pressure mounted. Petitions were launched. Civil suits began. Investigators reopened more than a dozen past cases linked to the former DA's office. But for Kyle, the real moment of closure came not with the headlines, but with the phone call he received 3 days later. It was from the State Board of Education. They had read his testimony, followed his story, and wanted to offer him a full scholarship to complete his degree at any school he chose in Pennsylvania. "Not because we feel sorry," the woman on the phone had said, "but because we believe voices like yours deserve every chance to lead." He hung up and cried for the first time since the arrest. Not out of fear, not out of frustration, out of gratitude. Meanwhile, Earl Mays stood at his own crossroads. A nonprofit advocacy group reached out to him with a surprising offer, a position as a consultant and community liaison. They wanted him to work on the inside, to help build reform strategies for how law enforcement deals with homeless populations and witnesses often deemed unreliable. At first, Earl laughed. "Me? Working with the same people who ignored me for 10 years? But the offer wasn't about apologies. It was about transformation. He visited the office, walked the hallways, met with directors, and after sitting in one long meeting full of data charts and policy memos, he stood up and said, "Y'all talk like the system's a machine. It ain't. It's people. Some good, some bad, but most, just scared to say what they really know." The room went silent, and Earl realized, maybe that's why they needed him. He took the job. Months passed. Vincent Doyle's trial began. This time, he was the one in the defendant's chair, facing evidence that no memo could hide. Missy Vargas was promoted to lead counsel on a justice reform task force. Alexis Banner, the whistleblower, was granted immunity and went on to testify in federal hearings about prosecutorial abuse. And Kyle? He transferred to Carnegie Mellon, majoring in systems engineering, but he also joined a student-led initiative to advocate for wrongfully convicted youth. Once a week, he visited high schools to talk about justice, bias, and the cost of silence. At one event, a boy raised his hand and asked, "What if no one believes me?" Kyle smiled. "Then keep speaking, because the truth doesn't need permission to be real. It just needs to be told." One autumn afternoon, Kyle returned to Liberty Park. The bench was still there. He sat alone, remembering the night he first met Earl. The night when a stranger's voice had cut through the noise and changed everything. He pulled out a notepad and wrote one sentence. "The verdict was never mine to carry, but the truth is now mine to defend." He folded it, placed it under the bench, and walked away.